All right, so today we're going to dive into Malcolm Gladwell's incredible book, The Bomber Mafia. And let me tell you, it's this gripping story about a small group of idealists, a revolutionary piece of tech, and this powerful, almost obsessive dream about how to make war, well, more humane. But it's also a story about what happens when those beautiful dreams smash right into the brutal realities of war. So we're going to start right in the middle of the action. Picture this. It's January 6, 1945, on the island of Guam. There's this brilliant young general, Haywood Hansel, and he's in charge of the most ambitious air campaign in history. He's doing it from the world's largest airport, which is basically built overnight in the Pacific. And then his commanding officer flies thousands of miles just to look him in the eye and say, "This isn't working. You're out." To understand how we got to that moment, you have to understand the story of the Bomber Mafia.
You see, at the heart of this whole thing are two generals who were, polar opposites. And their conflicting ideas, they really represent the central clash of the book, this battle between a beautiful idea and a very, very harsh reality.
Okay, so on one side, you've got General Haywood Hansel. That's the guy getting fired. He was an aristocrat, a poet, a total romantic. His favorite book was Don Quixote, which tells you a lot. He truly believed technology could make war precise, maybe even moral. And his replacement? General Curtis LeMay. Talk about a contrast. LeMay was a bulldog, a blunt, iron-willed guy who clawed his way up from a poor neighborhood in Ohio. LeMay didn't care about ideals. He cared about results. Period.
So, to really get why Hansel, the idealist, got the boot and was replaced by LeMay, the pragmatist, we've got to go back, way back, to the beginning. We need to understand this powerful, intoxicating dream that drove Hansel and his buddies for more than a decade.
37 million. Just let that number sink in for a second. That's how many people were killed or wounded in World War I. For the generation that lived through that, it was this profound trauma, this meat grinder of trench warfare that felt so pointless and barbaric. And that horror, it lit a fire under a new generation of airmen who became obsessed with finding a better, less bloody way to fight a war.
And that brings us to the Bomber Mafia. Now, I know what you're thinking, but no, this wasn't some criminal organization. It was actually a nickname, kind of a put-down, for this small band of super passionate, rebellious instructors at the Air Corps Tactical School down in Alabama. They were totally isolated, way off from the main military establishment, and they cooked up this truly revolutionary idea that bombers, flying high in broad daylight, could win a war all by themselves, without the slaughter of millions of soldiers on a battlefield.
So their whole new doctrine was built on four key beliefs. First, a heavily armed bomber was basically unstoppable. It would always get through. Second, because it was unstoppable, you could bomb during the day when you could actually see what you were aiming at. Third, because you could see the target, you could aim your bombs with surgical precision. And fourth, you could do all of this from way up high, a safe 30,000 feet, far above any enemy fire from the ground.
It was an audacious vision, right? Almost sounded crazy, but the Bomber Mafia was convinced it was possible. Why? Because their entire philosophy, this whole grand idea, rested on a single, revolutionary, almost mythical piece of technology.
And this was the promise, the Norden bomb sight. This thing was an incredibly complex analog computer built by a prickly, eccentric Dutch genius named Carl Norden. The bomb sight was so secret, bombardiers literally swore an oath to protect it with their lives. And it promised to do the impossible, to drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from over 6 miles up in the sky. This one machine made the Bomber Mafia's dream of a clean, precise war seem not just possible, but inevitable.
But here's the thing. While the Americans were dreaming of these surgical strikes, their closest allies, the British, were developing a completely different and way more brutal philosophy of air warfare. One that would create this stark choice between precision and just utter destruction.
And the difference in their philosophies was, well, night and day. The Americans wanted to hit very specific, crucial industrial targets, what they called choke points, to basically cripple the enemy's ability to make war. The British, on the other hand, they practiced something called area bombing. They weren't aiming at factories, they were aiming at entire cities. They flew at night, dropping thousands of bombs indiscriminately, with the explicit goal of destroying civilian homes and crushing the enemy's will to fight.
This brutal strategy was really championed by two key guys. First was Frederick Lindemann, Winston Churchill's best friend and top scientific advisor. He was a brilliant but, by all accounts, pretty venomous guy who used cold, hard numbers to argue for the systematic destruction of German working-class houses. The man who put that theory into practice was Arthur Harris, the head of the RAF Bomber Command, a man so ruthless, his own men called him Butcher Harris.
And this quote from Harris, wow, it just says it all, doesn't it? Harris believed Germany had started the bombing of civilians, and now they were going to get it back, tenfold. There was no room for precision or morality in his math, just pure retribution and breaking the enemy's will by any means necessary.
So as you can imagine, the Americans, led by the true believers from the Bomber Mafia, were just horrified by the British approach. So at a secret conference in Casablanca, they actually convinced Churchill to give them a chance to prove their theory was better. Their dream was finally going on trial, with a super high-stakes mission deep inside Nazi Germany.
The target they chose was straight out of a Bomber Mafia fantasy. See, nearly all of Germany's ball bearings, and you need those for every single machine of war, from tanks to planes, were made in just a handful of factories in one little medieval town, Schweinfurt. The strategists were convinced it was the Achilles heel of the entire Nazi war machine. Take out Schweinfurt, they thought, and you could bring German industry to a screeching halt. So Haywood Hansel, the idealist, he comes up with this ingenious but incredibly complicated plan. First, a diversionary force, led by none other than Curtis LeMay, would bomb an aircraft factory in another town, Regensburg. The goal was to draw all the German fighters into a huge air battle. Then, LeMay's plans would keep flying on to North Africa, luring those German fighters even further south. Only then would the main force show up to hit a now defenseless Schweinfurt.
But the plan was just too complex. It depended on perfect timing. And on the morning of the raid, August 17, 1943, a thick fog covered all the airfields in England. LeMay, ever the pragmatist, had actually drilled his crews on blind takeoffs and somehow got his planes in the air. But the main force heading to Schweinfurt, they were stuck on the ground for hours. By the time they finally took off, the German fighters that had attacked LeMay had already landed, refueled, rearmed, and were just waiting for them. The brilliant plan for one tough mission had unraveled into two separate, horrific bloodbaths.
But here's the thing. Even if the timing had been perfect, there was another catastrophic problem. The Norden bomb site itself was not the miracle machine they thought it was. In the brutal reality of combat, it failed. The extreme cold up at 30,000 feet made its lubricants thick and gummy. Under the insane stress of being shot at, bombardiers would tense up and lean forward, throwing off the whole delicate calibration. And maybe most importantly, pilots who were desperately trying to avoid getting shot down couldn't fly the long, straight, level path the bomb site needed to work. And half the time, the target was just covered by clouds anyway, making the site completely useless.
And so, the Schweinfurt raid, the one that was meant to be the ultimate proof of the Bomber Mafia's doctrine, it became its final verdict. And the results? They were just devastating. 60! The Americans lost 60 B-17 bombers in a single day, and each one of those planes had a crew of 10 men. It was a catastrophic, completely unsustainable loss for the 8th Air Force.
And the human cost was even more staggering. 552 highly trained American airmen were either killed or captured on that one mission. It was one of the bloodiest days for the Air Force in the entire war.
And what do they get for all this sacrifice? The attack only managed to cause a temporary 33% drop in German ball bearing production. The factories were repaired and back up to speed in a matter of weeks. It wasn't the choke point they had dreamed of at all.
And the final, damning conclusion came from the U.S. military itself. Its own post-war analysis found that the raid on Schweinfurt, the mission that was supposed to cripple the Nazi war machine and validate an entire decade of theory, had no measurable effect at all. The dream had failed its ultimate test.
Which brings us right back to where we started, that Kwanzaa hut on Guam. The dream of a clean, precise, moral war, it was beautiful. But in the skies over Germany, it proved to be an illusion. And in war, when idealism fails, pragmatism takes over. Haywood Hansel, the poet, the dreamer, was sent home. And Curtis LeMay, the bulldog who only cared about winning, was put in charge. And it leaves us with a really difficult question. What happens when a beautiful dream meets a brutal reality? And when you're forced to choose, which side would you be on?